Okay, I want to introduce Jim Colston, our next speaker, so if we could find our seats, I appreciate that. Jim's going to talk about enhanced source control to support potable reuse. This is a big issue for NWRI and the state that came out of the expert panel to evaluate the feasibility of uniform water recycling criteria. And it's a big deal because source control programs across California and the United States vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, while if they're required by the federal regulations to have a pretreatment program, they do for the most case. A number of small systems, and these are places where there is acute water stress, do not have source control programs. So not only is the state looking here in California to develop additional criteria for utilities that have source control programs to create source control programs that support potable reuse, they're also looking to develop for the first time source control programs for smaller utilities that traditionally have not had them. So it's a big challenge. They want to know, how do they perform? What are the indicators of the high performance of pretreatment program, and how do we know those contribute to public health? In fact, NWRI has we're going to be hosting an expert panel on this very subject here in the coming months, and so Mr. Colston's presentation here is timely. Jim began his career at the Orange County Sanitation District in 1989 as an industrial waste inspector. Since then, he's held numerous positions, including legal and regulatory affairs liaison, environmental supervisor, and environmental compliance and regulatory affairs manager. Today, he is the Director of Environmental Services. In his current position, he oversees over 90 staff members who support compliance with state and federal regulatory agencies, including the South Coast Air Quality Management District, CalRecycle, the California State Water Resources Control Board, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Colston's education includes a BS in biochemistry from the University of California, Riverside, and a JD from the Western State College of Law in Fullerton. He's been a member of the California Bar since 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Colston. Congratulations. Good luck.
Thank you very much. I heard all of this conversation going on. I'm sure that the earlier presentation sparked just a whole bunch of thinking and questioning and folks wanting to have conversations with each other. So I just want to use that as a plug to say that in the future, come to the award of the Clarke Prize the night before. Last night was absolutely fantastic. It was a chance to meet the award winner and the prior award winners in a more relaxed atmosphere, have a lot of wonderful conversations. And they are very genuinely nice people who are more than happy to talk about their work. So it was a real pleasure last night. I encourage you next year to do the same. So good morning. I am Jim Colston with the Orange County Sanitation District. I'm really excited to talk with you about potable reuse and the source control necessary to allow for potable reuse. And I couldn't go on without saying congratulations to Dr. Haas and the work that he has done and continues to do, and how important that is. And when I saw that his theme was water science and water technology, I was really excited because my theme is really on the overlap between the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So traditionally, wastewater treatment facilities, there's over 15,000 in the United States, have focused on the Clean Water Act, which some of you folks may not be familiar with this. I do think it's important to understand a little bit about the background of why it is that we do what we do. And so the idea there, going all the way back to the early 70s, was to get the pollutants out of our receiving waters and to make those waters fishable and swimmable again. So it really wasn't on our minds that we would at one point connect with the Safe Drinking Water Act and be working towards providing that water supply to the public. And so that's where we are now. We're starting to merge. So a little bit about us. I think this is important because the reality is it is easier for the large entities to take these projects on. And so you see Orange County, you see San Diego, you see Los Angeles, where these projects are occurring. And it's not an accident that these are large service areas, large facilities, relatively large numbers of employees who work there. and have some capability to take on these types of projects. And so that does matter, and it will matter as we want to progress with potable reuse, how we deal with that gap when we're talking about medium and smaller sized entities. So we serve over 2.5 million people. We have approximately, I believe it's a total of about 800,000 connections, somewhere over 500,000 residential, and then the rest being commercial and industrial in our service area. We do, though, contract to the wider service area through a brine line. Now, the size of this is a little bit scary. However, those are all permitted, and currently there are only a number of permits in the 80s. So you'll see a little bit by comparison. So while it is a large service area where we do have some brine flows that come down, it's a smaller number of dischargers, and also those flows currently are not recycled for potable reuse, although certainly we want to understand and be able to look at all potential flows for reuse. So the Environmental Services Department at the Sanitation District has a large number of staff. It's broken down into what we call now the Resource Protection Division, which includes the Pretreatment or Source Control Program, and then our Laboratory Ocean Monitoring and Compliance Division. And the reason I think this is important is that I will focus a little bit more on the resource protection, but there's a lot of important work that also happens in conjunction with our laboratory, and then also with our compliance folks. So on the one side, on the source control side, we have what I would call the white hats, where we regulate industry and others, and then on the far right side, if you want to say, we wear the black hat, where we're the regulated entity. And understanding that point of view of those two sides is really important, because again, as I'm talking about the merger of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, it's bringing those two sides together. So I want to provide a little bit of background and understanding of pretreatment. I think it'll really be helpful for folks. I know that there's a large number of academic folks here, and so you may not be familiar with why we do the things we do, how we operate, and I want to provide a little bit of that background. So these, on the left here, is our ocean discharge permit. That contains the specific requirements for us to have a pretreatment program. This is a federally mandated program. Our permit is jointly issued by the State Water Resources Control Board and the United States EPA because we discharge out past the 3-mile limit into federal waters. However, the state is fully delegated to issue permits, and so every permit issued by the state of California would include pretreatment requirements, assuming that there's a sufficient industrial base to necessitate that. And then from there, you develop local limits. Now, traditionally, the local limits are designed to protect your receiving water. So the Clean Water Act requirements are focused on treating wastewater sewage. They're not focused on treating toxicants. And so that's the idea of the National Pretreatment Program, is to remove those toxicants before they come into the plant. So I'll focus first a little bit on the industrial side. This is something that we've been doing for a long time, and it's something that we're familiar with. The basics are that we have a wastewater ordinance that's been adopted that gives us legal authority to regulate discharges into the sewer system. We issue permits based on that ordinance. We go out on a frequent basis. In our case, with industry, it's quarterly. We conduct inspections and monitoring of the facilities. And then we have a progressive enforcement response plan in case we have industries that are not complying with their permits and with our ordinance. So that's your basics of industrial pretreatment right there. And we lay it out, two of the elements. I'll get to the third one when we talk about the enhanced system. So it's the industrial source control, which is that permitting and enforcement, and then we have our inspection staff who do the sampling and the monitoring and the inspections, most of the inspections of the facilities. So a little bit about us. Again, I was emphasizing the size. I think it's important. There are nearly 60 federal categorical industries. Now, when you're a categorical industry, you have to meet standards that have been set by the EPA, where they go out and they evaluate the various types of industries, and then based on that evaluation, they will impose standards that those industries can meet prior to discharge to the sewer system. Then those that aren't categorical, so you see the other industrial, they have to meet our local limits. But I wanted to include on here, we have a number of other types of permits, and this is important because this can impact your potable reuse. In the case of special purpose discharge permits, these tend to be dewatering permits, usually associated with construction, but also with site cleanups. The good news about those types of permits is they tend not to change in water quality. Once you get a pretty good analysis of what that looks like, you have an understanding of the treatment train that they need and the discharge. But that is a new source. Waste haulers, they have strict requirements, but this is an area where you can get mischief. And so you really need to watch that very carefully. Urban runoff, when some of you may recall back in about the year 2000, there were beach closures along Huntington Beach associated with new water quality bacterial standards. From the Assembly Bill 411 that was adopted in 1997 here in California. And that resulted in closures, and a lot of investigation, a lot of money, a lot of effort went into understanding that, because the beaches in California, especially here in Orange County, are really the jewel of our county, and it's not something that you want to lose. The number of visitors that we have in Orange County just to the beaches, when we did an assessment at that time, just in our service area, basically going from Seal Beach to Corona del Mar area, we found about 17 million visitors a year. So it's a huge number of folks, and you don't want to be sending them away. And so that study showed us that urban runoff was the primary source of the problems that we had. So we took on an effort to accept urban runoff, dry weather urban runoff only, into our system as a way to help the county and the local cities to protect beach water quality. So of course there was a lot of concern about the quality of those waters. I mean, you talk about opening up your sewer system to anything. So a lot of work was done, and it continues to be done. Those facilities are all permitted. They all do regular monitoring. We do regular monitoring as well. But the good news was that the water quality there is quite good. And I have to say I was skeptical about stormwater outreach programs that the county primarily does. But I think when you look over the last 20 years, they have been surprisingly successful to help educate the public to stop dumping into the storm water system. And so while I'm sure it still occurs on a smaller scale, on a large scale, what we've done publicly has been a great success. And then finally, I'll just mention that we have the other permits. You see here the SAPA permit. So that's that area that's under contract with us in the wider watershed to accept brine and other non-reclaimable wastes. So how effective has the traditional source control program been? Our flows have remained around the 200 million gallons per day range. You'll see here they've gone up and down. But in that same time, from the late 70s until now, we've gone from an influent, I'm sorry that says effluent, but it's an influent heavy metals of nearly 2,000 pounds per day to where we are today, less than 20 pounds per day of influent heavy metals. So it's been a tremendous success over the years. And that shows you the, I'll call it the traditional source control program. So thank you for indulging me on that little trip. We'll go now more towards the enhanced program. And you can see this was a focus of our program, right? It was not on Safe Drinking Water Act. It was protecting our receiving waters. It was protecting the biosolids because that material is recycled primarily to farmland. And then also because we're in the South Coast Air Quality Management District, very strict air quality rules. And of course, nobody wants to be a bad neighbor. Those who are familiar with our facilities, they're located right down near the coast with expensive properties around it, and so you don't want to be odorous and you don't want to be emitting toxics. So that's been our focus. But now where are we? What are we worried about? Well, now we have recycled water permit limits. We have an advanced water treatment system that we want to protect. We have emerging constituents, and this is really important because the truth of the matter is, in the past, the environment was a buffer. If something was happening, you would have time to discover that and react to it. But now if you're going to move to potable reuse, as we've seen in the earlier presentations, you don't necessarily have that time to react. And you don't want to erode confidence in the public water system. And so that's a different mission from fishable, swimmable, which we focused on in the past. Just for comparison's sake here, under the groundwater replenishment system, you see 101 regulated constituents. Under the ocean plan, 94 constituents. So there's 41 overlapping constituents. Oops, and I think that's important, because now there's all of this, right? We haven't focused on this in the past. We've only focused on this circle here. So that's part of our new mission now, is understanding what are those constituents that we need to protect against, and also emerging constituents. We do work in conjunction with the Orange County Water District on the groundwater replenishment system. I'll just briefly throw this up here. I know that many folks are aware of it, but this is their advanced water purification system, advanced water treatment factory. And, but just note up front is the enhanced source control. So that starts at the beginning. That's before you do treatment. So we need to understand what do we need to do so that when you get to the end of the train, people are able to drink the water and they have confidence in the water. We do have some regulatory support here, and I apologize that the slide is busy, but I can summarize a little bit of it for you. You do need to assess the fate of certain chemicals and contaminants. You need to do source investigations of those chemicals. You need to have an outreach program to industrial, commercial, and residential facilities. And you need to keep an inventory of the chemicals and contaminants identified under this section here. So now we've added this third column to our pretreatment program. We're now focused on using our local limits as a tool to protect water for potable reuse, not just the receiving waters as we've done in the past, or the treatment plants and the collection system. They're also included in that. We've updated our ordinance with specific language. We have done an assessment and looked at CECs, and most notably there, a lot of work was done in our laboratory to be able to test for these, to be able to understand what they are. And then we've added some components that were specific to our needs. Fats, oil, and grease is pretty widely understood in California as an issue to be addressed. It's not specifically an issue for potable reuse, but anything that interferes with the smooth operation of our facilities is going to interfere ultimately with potable reuse. So we don't want those problems. We don't want the problems of toxicants that have been associated with dry cleaners, PERC, radiator shops, high doses of metals. Our urban runoff program, I already touched on that. And the new program is a dental amalgam that EPA has just come out with. So let's take a look first. Technical evaluation of local limits. Again, a very busy slide, and I apologize for that. But I just wanted to note here that if you see around where the red checked lines are here, that we did do some changes to our ordinance specifically for the protection of potable reuse, including the addition of 1,4-dioxane with a 1 milligram per liter limit. We altered from a TTO limit to a general prohibition on organics that would interfere with recycling. We also added other prohibition language against discharges that would interfere with recycling water and recycling biosolids. There were, as you can see, other changes associated with recycling of biosolids. So it's that theme now that we're moving away from just a receiving water focus to a recycling focus. Now, another important component, as was mentioned in the earlier section, is outreach. And we have a number of outreach. What to Flush is a part of our campaign that we share. And why this is important is that we don't want, in the same way that we don't want the storm drain to be used for people dumping oil or other chemicals in there, we don't want people to use the sewer system as a trash can. And there'll be some other specifics here. But I think that's a really important theme, and it's one that with potable reuse we need to get out to folks about the water cycle, that we're now part of the water cycle. So you don't want to contaminate the water cycle, and you also don't want to cause interference with the sewer system. Another outreach that we have is our FOG program. I mentioned that previously, but that we do that to control oil and grease to prevent sewer spills primarily. Then the inventory. So we have a number of means to do assessments of what is out there in our service area. And this is really important when you have an issue that arises. So when you get a call saying, hey, we've detected this particular compound, and you have a service area of 2.6 million people, where do you go, right? You can't knock on 2.5 million doors. So you need means such as a repository of information about who's using what chemicals as a place to start. We also, in conjunction with LA County SAN and others, have participated in help to found the No Drugs Down the Drain program. Again, that's that campaign about just putting the 3 Ps into the toilet, not putting your pharmaceuticals. But this is one of those issues where you face challenges, because I had a colleague just this last week tell me how fentanyl patches have a warning on there to put them into the toilet, flush them down the toilet. Well, we don't want them to do that. But I also read that the problem that they've been having with these patches it has literally occurred on a number of occasions where the grandchild has taken grandma or grandpa's fentanyl patch from the trash can and put it on themselves, and unfortunately has died, because that's a much higher dose of something that they can tolerate than their grandparent. And so, you can see where you have these societal challenges. How do we deal with that? We don't want them to put it in the toilet, but we do want them to have a way to dispose of it so that, that's an extreme example, but obviously, losing a child because of the improper disposal. So what are the challenges that we have faced in our program? Things that we've actually seen. We've had challenges with contract agencies. I mentioned earlier with the brine line, where we have a contract there. They have to do a substantially similar pretreatment program to the program that we implement. And we had some problems there. We conducted an audit, we did a remedial plan, and we helped to get them up to speed. But that means it's part of our job to police that contract and make sure that they're living up to their requirements in the same way that we are. We've had incidences of dumping, in particular acetone. That can be very difficult to catch. But it can have a serious impact on meeting your standard there when you've got that total organic standard. N-nitrosyl dimethylamine, NDMA, that is I'll call it a stubborn pollutant because of the way it forms and reforms, and it's been a challenge. The worst part was that we were shooting ourselves in the foot. We were using coagulants in our plant as part of the treatment, and we were putting NDMA into our own system. So the good news there, of course, is it's a lot easier to solve the problem when you're creating the problem. So that was, it was easier to handle. But nevertheless, it's an area where we're doing a lot of research, and the Water District is doing a lot of research, and we're looking at what are the sources of that. We're contemplating a future limit for it, but we really want to understand more before we just put a number the same way we did with 1,4-dioxane, because there you also have that added complication of formation. 1,4-dioxane, we did put a limit in for that. We got a number of inquiries at the time. We were able to have conversations with the industrial discharges about that, and so far we've been successful in keeping the discharges down. Radioactive materials, that's more challenging. That's a field that's occupied by the federal government. So we had to work with the Radiological Health Branch on that so that they would implement their lowest achievable standards on those who are using radioactive materials in the service area so as to prevent the discharge into the system. The good news is that virtually all are well rejected by the system with the exception of tritium, but I think when you get back to that issue of public confidence, you want to be able to tell people that those materials are being well managed. So those are some of the challenges that we faced, and one of the tools that we used, in particular with 1,4-dioxane, I mentioned the chemical inventories. Well, we also have an area-wide GIS system, and so we were able to use that. We use a technique, we call it downstream sampling, but we use a technique whereby we bracket areas of our system until we can locate the source of a pollutant. And so we were able to very effectively do that, and the GIS system is vital for that. It helps you to quickly find from any point in the system what's upstream, what's downstream, what's tributary, and what's not. certified analytical laboratory. Now actually here I'm showing the Water District's lab. They have an excellent lab. In my opinion, we also have an excellent lab. A lot of staff who are well educated and well trained. And I'm not saying that to be braggadocious, but again, it gets back to that we have a resource that not everyone who wants to do potable reuse is going to have. And so even if they get access to a private lab to be able to do some of the things that we've done, it still raises the question, are they going to have the in-house expertise to understand what it is they're looking at in terms of the information? And so that's an area that I think is a challenge for us. You know, when you drive a car, you know, we run the gamut, right? Some people just put in the key or push the button and they drive it and they know nothing else about the car. And then there's another neighbor who could take it apart and put it back together again. So to some extent, you need some expertise when you're having potable reuse to understand what it is that you're doing. And that expertise is very important. And you have, you know, the Water Institute here, you have the Water Reuse Association, and those are vital to the success of these programs. But I think the question will become, to what extent can the smaller and medium size duplicate what we're doing? Where are those gaps going to be? The gaps in staff on the pretreatment side, if they only have 1 or 2 staff members, or the laboratory side, will they have the expertise to understand what it is that they're facing? I'm just trying to bring to you the real world of what we're seeing out there so that you folks can help us. There's also another thing that we use to address these challenges, and I think this is where, again, you get to that mix of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and what are you putting into the water cycle? And so we are seeing legislation being used as a tool to address some of these issues. All the way back in the 1990s, Margie Neller with the LA County Sanitation Districts, and Ann, she's here, Heil, fought to get lindane banned from certain products because it only took a small dose of lindane for them to violate their receiving water permit limits. And so this isn't anything new, but it's also an area that's not really our wheelhouse, right? I mean, this isn't typically what we do, is go to the Sacramento or Washington, D.C. and say, hey, we want you to ban this and we want you to ban that, and that's not the typical approach that we take. But it is nevertheless a tool in the toolbox, and one that I think we're going to need to think seriously about, and certainly the associations can be important there, because the associations are a place for people to share this information of what their needs are. And almost to the end here, new technologies are incredibly important here. We're on the dirty side, right? It's a lot harder to do analyses of the wastewater, in my opinion, I think that's a fair statement, than it is on the clean water side. And so we're always testing new technologies on our system to see if they will work, to see what we can detect at what levels and in what time period. So, you know, ultimately, when you go back to the diagram and you see that source control is ahead of the treatment process, we would love to have more information in that sewer system or right at the headworks that we can react to. It's a challenge, but it's one that we are nevertheless exploring and hope to find more solutions to help us have an early warning of a problem coming into the system. So, what's this crazy diagram here? I'm not expecting you to be able to read that. The point of this is, when we started all this, we didn't have a means of what are we doing if something happens. And so we literally, right, we're engineers and scientists, came up with a flow chart. So if then, you know, if this is detected, we talk to this person and they do that thing. And so this is what we came up with. Oops, I'm going in reverse here. And I just wanted to show that, you know, this is what it came to for us, that we literally had to come up with a flow chart. It also, this was important because we do work in conjunction with the Water District, so it's not all in one house. So we needed to have that clear delineation that, hey, at this point in the process, we need to reach out to our neighbors and say that we've detected this, or they come to us and say they have a problem with that. And so I just wanted to show you this little chart as I'm getting close to the end here. Oh, I'm at the end. So with that, I would be glad to take questions if there's time. But I did want to say that, you know, in the news, there's all this negativity about federal and state government. And I've never been prouder of the work that we're doing at the Orange County Sanitation District. I've been there for 28 years. come on down, do a tour of our facility, tour the water district. You might get your faith restored in government, at least local government, that there are people working to provide for their communities. In this case, we want to make sure you have safe drinking water. We want to make sure we're removing the sanitation from your facility, and we want to protect the water quality environment. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. One thing I've always been impressed about when I come here to California is the awareness, the connectivity between what you call the dirty water side and the clean water side. But yet, when I go to a meeting like WebTech, the vast bulk of utilities there, I don't get that sense that they have that awareness of connectivity. And so I'm wondering if there are lessons that could help be used to educate, those 20 some odd thousand other utilities about this connection.
That I mentioned the associations, and you're in particular mentioning WEF. Here's Jeff talking about the merging of the research institutes with me earlier today. I think that's a connection right there. I think what water reuse is doing. I was in Sacramento last year testifying so that we could bottle some of the water and use that. Because when people come and they tour the groundwater replenishment system and they taste the water, the result is just nearly unanimous in how great they think that system is. So we wanted a way to reach out. And so this bottle legislation was done, and we were very fortunate. We have these PR folks. I think they're wizards. I couldn't do this stuff to save my life, but they, knew that we were having somehow it was a slow news day and it was a hot day, and I don't remember the exact month, February, March, and they went into Hollywood and they started giving out these bottles, and it caught on. NPR did a story about it, others did a story about it, and so it's that getting that message out about what it is that we're doing. And even just talking like we are right here. So I think that it gets to that issue of the size again. If you're a small or medium size, you're going to focus on what matters to you at that moment, and everything else is noise. It might be interesting, if you're like me, if you're kind of a news junkie, a technology junkie, you're going to like that. But for others, they're just not going to focus as much. But I think if we get that message up, that'll help.
Just a couple more. I'm going to get you, and then I'm going to have you last, and then we have to move on.
I'm just curious how Orange County Sanitation District is responding to the recently signed Assembly Bill 967 for disposal of human remains, liquefied human remains. Yes, in California, that is a thing we are dealing with. Just interested to see how you're responding.
That's a great question. So, that legislation gives folks the flexibility about accepting that waste. And so I would expect that the next move that you're going to see is that our joint board will discuss that issue and come up with direction to staff on how to handle it. But we have a joint board, 3 members from each agency, and for me that just from the beginning of that legislation was ripe for them as the policymakers to make a statement about what they want to do with that waste.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Hi there. You mentioned a lot about confidence in the water system. How is Orange County addressing confidence in the water system among low-income or minority constituents who may buy bottled water or may go to vending machines that may not be safe or may be less cost-effective? So how are you reaching out to those people?
Right. Well, I hate to have to punt a question, but because I don't actually work at the water district, that's more their focus. On my side, in terms of the confidence, what I want to do is to be able to say that what we're doing to protect the water quality for everyone, including those who may be in low-income areas or people who maybe they don't have much understanding about water quality. So in that sense, me personally, I'm just trying to do my part of protecting the water quality. What I will say, though, and I mentioned it about coming down. So we had last year, I believe, 10,000 tours, and a huge number of those tours are to junior high, high school, and even college students. and now many nurses in training. And so that's a great chance because there are wealthy and low-income communities all around our plant, so it's very convenient for people to come down and take those tours. And I think that really gets our message out, is when they come and they see the facilities, when they taste the water, when they go home and they tell their families, you won't believe, what I saw today and what I learned today. And so, as I mentioned, personally, that's a little bit of a weakness for me, but I know that the two agencies work really hard to get the message out of what they're doing to provide a safe water supply.
Please join me in thanking Jim Colston.